created it appear to have thrived in the Mediterranean for centuries, but then they simply disappeared. Just as in the story of Atlantis, it seems this entire civilization was wiped from the face of the earth in a sudden and violent catastrophe. The first clues to what might have happened lie in the sea that surrounds the island. The whole of the Mediterranean is divided into two tectonic plates, with Europe on one side and Africa on the other. These two colossal land masses collide, and periodically the energy of these collisions is released in earthquakes.
The archaeological evidence for earthquakes is very difficult to detect here, partly because, of course, they rebuilt and repaired immediately afterwards. There is one instance, however, on the south side in the so-called House of the Fallen Blocks. It seems that at the end of the First Palace period, there was a huge earthquake, and these enormous blocks were thrown several meters to the south, and there they remain today as evidence of this enormous earthquake.
Our experts have discovered that the palace engineers devised new and innovative techniques to create structures that would withstand the destructive force of these violent quakes.
Simply put,
Today, our team are keen to learn from the experience of the palace engineers, and they study closely the anti-seismic techniques deployed at Knossos.
In order to make their tall, skinny walls stand up, it's quite probable that the first thing they did was to buttress them up, rather like this. So if I pretend to be an earthquake and shake this table here, well, as we can see, buttressing on its own doesn't do the job.
In the final phase of building at the palace, walls were constructed of stone and supported by an ingenious system of wooden frames. This combination of materials gave the structure both enormous strength and flexibility.
So what the people of Knossos did was to use timber framing to reinforce their thin masonry walls and support the framed up wall off big heavy walls, buttressing like this. And if I pretend to be an earthquake machine again and give it a good old shake, we can rapidly see that I could be shaking that all day long, and this wall is going precisely nowhere.
Despite these incredible engineering achievements, nothing was going to save the palace from the devastating cataclysm to come. Seismologists that have been studying the geological history of the area now believe that Crete suffered a cataclysmic event around 1500 BC. This new evidence shows that Crete was struck by a massive and deadly wave.
Dozens of tsunamis swept across the entire Aegean. Tsunami, tsunami, tsunami. Trains of these waves.
On the Mediterranean island of Crete, archaeologists have discovered the remains of an ancient palace. These stunning buildings are the first trace of a culture that has been missing for 3,500 years, and many believe that the palace was at the heart of the most famous of all lost worlds, the civilization of Atlantis. Just like Atlantis, the Palace of Knossos and the island of Crete were devastated in a cataclysmic event. In search of the source of this destruction, experts have focused on a volcanic island 100 miles north of Crete. It was known in ancient times as Thera. Today, it is Santorini. Volcanologist Floyd McCoy has made it his life's work to decipher the geological clues and piece together the island's destructive history.
This volcano has an amazing history of repeated giant explosions. With every explosion, this hole in the ground, which we call a caldera, is re-excavated repeatedly. And every time it blows itself apart, It leaves a deposit on the landscape, and layer by layer, it built itself up. And so what we see over there are the layers of these repeated explosive eruptions through tens of thousands of years.
At the center of Santorini, inside the cliffs of the main island, is Nea Kamenni, the new furnace. It is a barren and hostile island, peaked by the crater of an active volcano. Floyd McCoy has discovered that there was once an island right at the center of the caldera. It was swallowed up by a terrible volcanic eruption.
Occupying this large caldera then was this large island that a civilization lived on. It's gone. The island was blasted to bits.
Plato wrote of a devastating cataclysm that destroyed the great civilization of Atlantis. And Santorini, the closest neighbor to Crete and the Palace of Knossos, was the location of one of the biggest explosions in recorded history. Researchers have developed a new theory, that Santorini and Crete were both a part of Atlantis. The theory has its basis in the dramatic color of these cliffs. Plato described quarries in Atlantis where rocks of white, black, and red were extracted from the hills. The rock was then used in the construction of a great island city. The description matches the rocks found here in Santorini. This island city was described as being laid out in a series of concentric circles of land and water, each one connected to the ocean by an immense canal 100 feet deep.
There were also docks for huge numbers of ships and a causeway over which they could offload the riches, whatever they were, that were coming into Atlantis. In other words, everything that human beings could need was available in Atlantis itself.
Plato's description of the island as circular relates perfectly to the symmetrical formation of the central volcanic island on Santorini. But to prove a link is impossible without proof of life on the island before its last big eruption. Then, in the early 1900s, during excavations in a quarry here, a fantastic discovery was made.
That layer, that white layer on top of the cliffs, is a deposit left from the catastrophic eruption in the Bronze Age. And it was digging there that they found a house site. In another case, they found a burial. They realized this eruption had buried a civilization, a culture lived there. The story then of that ancient civilization starts there with that layer of white ash.
These volcanic deposits, which still cover the entire island, fell in the course of a single cataclysmic eruption. Now our experts are stripping back the ash layer by layer to expose evidence of the lost world that lies beneath.
Here it is. This is the level that man lived on, right here. Here, in fact, is what appears to be a remnant of a wall built by man on top. And then the eruption came. The big blast started, and all of this was deposited. This is pumice, and the pumice piled up very rapidly. And then the eruption continued, 4 days of a massive accumulation of all of this material all up here, 30, 50, 60, 80 feet of this material piling up, and then way up at the top, the debris flows, the mud flows that scoured the surface. All of this, one of the giant eruptions in human history.
The first signs of life from before this big eruption had been found, and the search was on to reveal proof of a culture that would link the island to the great civilizations of Crete and Atlantis. The answer was unearthed in 1966 by an American archaeologist named James Mavor Jr. Mavor assembled a team to search the islands for signs of ancient artifacts. They began their dig on the southern tip of the island, in the tiny village of Akrotiri. In their very first trench, they struck gold. They unearthed an ancient wall buried under 30 feet of volcanic rock. As they dug deeper, The wall became a house, and the trench revealed a cobbled street. At their very first attempt, Maver's team had discovered an extraordinary town, perfectly preserved in the ash of a volcanic eruption.
We are talking about a brilliant culture, brilliant civilization with a very advanced technology in all ways, and especially building technology.
The discovery was hailed as one of the most important finds in classical archaeology. The town remained substantially intact. Just like the city of Pompeii in Italy, volcanic ash had filled the city and sealed it from the elements. Its contents had been preserved for more than 30 centuries. The huge task of uncovering the town continues today. With every inch of ash that is removed, new clues to the civilization that was here are revealed. And just as described in the legend of Atlantis, we see engineering skills that were sophisticated way beyond their time.
When I first came to Akrotiri, I was expecting something rather simple. But then I realized that this town was made of multi-story buildings. And when we are talking about multi-story, we are talking about 2- and 3-story buildings. And at some point, I realized that I was walking on the 3rd floor of a building that had been constructed 3,500 years ago. That was really extremely impressive.
Akrotiri is a truly extraordinary find. It is a city arranged with a structured assembly of interconnecting roads and paths, the earliest form of organized town planning ever discovered, and centuries more advanced than anything that has ever been seen before from this period. Archaeologists have mapped every inch of the town, and from their data, our team have built computer-generated models. You are now traveling down the streets and interacting with the buildings of a sophisticated community that was destroyed at the height of its power thousands of years ago. Just as we have seen in the Palace of Knossos, at Akrotiri there are complex multi-story buildings constructed of wood and stone. And the plumbing was even more elaborate. Fresh running water fed each house, and a sewerage system ran throughout the entire town.
There is a perfect sewage system running under the streets, and these are connected to lavatories on the upper floors of the buildings.
Not for at least 1,000 years would it become commonplace to find bathrooms inside people's homes.
The discovery of this lavatory, as you can imagine, is truly very important. If you just stop to think, it took ages, hundreds of years to have lavatories within a house.
It was not just the discovery of a toilet that so amazed the engineers, but also its ingenious design. The waste fell through a clay pipe to a chamber below, where water from the town drains flushed it into a cesspit. The pipes interconnected in such a way that a siphon effect was formed, drawing foul smells down the pipes and away from the lavatory. The design was centuries ahead of its time. This sophisticated system of water management matches up to the stories of Atlantis, in which Plato wrote of ancient towns equipped with hot and cold running water. But there was one crucial discovery at Akrotiri that lent new credibility to the idea that Santorini was the island at the center of Atlantis. A fresco was unearthed that revealed an image of life on the island 3,500 years ago.
Can we be so lucky as to have a snapshot of what this landscape looked like? Here is the peninsula, the Akrotiri Peninsula. It shows a profile of the island, 1, 2, 3 peaks. Going down farther, we see a waterway that surrounds a central island, a fairly large island. And on that island, a city. They were living on the central island. That central island was a developing volcano.
This idea of a central island port encircled with layer upon layer of buildings fits perfectly Plato's description of the island city of Atlantis, a city